right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, something a little different. We're going to tackle the grammatical gender of countries in Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
You heard that right.
It's a fun one.
Even countries get a label, masculine or feminine, in Spanish.
Absolutely.
We've got a ton of linguistic research for this one, maps, even anecdotes from native speakers. So get ready to find out why Spain uses, la China, but el Japón.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating mix. You've got history in there, word structure, and even a little cultural perspective, all woven right into the language.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
All right, so get this. We're diving into the world of grammatical gender today.
Oh, wow.
Hold on. We're not talking about, people. We're talking about countries. You know how some languages assign genders to nouns?
Right.
Well, Spanish does that with countries, too. We've got this map here. It's showing countries in pink and blue based on whether they're grammatically masculine or feminine. And some of these choices are pretty wild.
Yeah, what's so fascinating is how these, seemingly random assignments actually reveal a lot about history and cultural perceptions, and even a bit of political maneuvering. We're going to be looking at your sources to uncover those hidden stories.
Yeah, why is Great Britain feminine, but the United Kingdom is masculine? And get this, you'll almost never hear a Spanish speaker call the USA America.
Right.
Why is that? We're going to unpack all of that today, exploring the hows and whys behind these gender assignments. And trust me, it's way more interesting than just memorizing grammar rules.
Indeed, it's a window into how language reflects our understanding of the world.
Okay, so for those who might not be familiar with Spanish, can you give us a quick rundown of how this whole grammatical gender thing works?
Sure, so think of it like a linguistic categorization system. Every noun in Spanish, whether it's a table, an idea, or a country, gets assigned a gender, masculine or feminine. This affects things like which articles you use, el for masculine, la for feminine, and how adjectives agree with the noun. But remember, it's not about actual gender like we think of it in English.
Right, it's more like a linguistic quirk. That can sometimes seem a bit arbitrary. So looking at our sources, where do these country gender assignments come from? Is there some kind of method to the madness?
There are definitely patterns we can uncover. Sometimes it's as simple as looking at the word ending. For instance, nouns ending in A are often feminine, while those ending in O are typically masculine.
Okay, so Gran Bretaña ending in A is feminine, which is why we say La Gran Bretaña. Makes sense. But then we have Reino Unido, which is masculine. El Reino Unido. What makes that different?
That's a great example of how the meaning of the word can override the ending rule. Reino Unido is built around the word reino, meaning kingdom, which is a masculine noun in Spanish. So the whole phrase becomes masculine.
Uh-huh. So it's not always about the ending. Sometimes it's about the core concept of the word itself. I'm already seeing how much deeper this goes than just surface-level grammar.
Absolutely. Sometimes the gender assignment is a historical hangover, where a country retains an older Spanish name that defies the usual rules. For example, think about Estados Unidos, the United States. It's masculine because Estados, meaning states, is a masculine noun.
And that explains why Spanish speakers wouldn't use America for the USA, because America in Spanish refers to
the entire continent, North, Central, and South America combined. It's a feminine noun, La America. This often causes confusion for English speakers. We're used to America, specifically referring to the United States.
Right. It's almost like looking at two different maps. It really highlights how language can shape our whole perception of geography. So we've got word endings, historical names, anything else playing into these gender assignments?
Sometimes modern name changes force the Spanish language to adapt. Take Swaziland, which officially became Eswatini. The traditional Spanish name Swazilandia was feminine because of the A ending. But the newer Eswatini, lacking that A, is generally seen as masculine.
Wow. So A simple name change can actually flip a country's gender. That's wild. Now, what about places with names that sound plural, like the United Arab Emirates?
That one's actually pretty straightforward. It's Los Emiratos Árabes Unidos. Masculine plural because Emiratos itself is masculine. The same logic applies to Los Estados Unidos. It all comes back to that root word.
Okay, I'm starting to get the hang of this, but looking at this map, I'm noticing a lot of pink, a lot of feminine countries, especially those big land masses. Is that a coincidence?
You've hit on another fascinating pattern. Islands and continents tend to be feminine by default in Spanish. This likely stems from the concept of la tierra, meaning the earth, being grammatically feminine. So we have La Gran Bretaña, La Antártida for Antarctica.
Wait, even though Antarctica doesn't end in A, it's still feminine?
Exactly. Even though Ida endings can sometimes deviate from the typical feminine A, La Antártida stays stubbornly feminine because of that landmass tradition. It's like a linguistic time capsule, preserving that ancient association.
A linguistic time capsule. I love that. It really shows how these seemingly simple grammatical choices can reflect centuries of history and cultural perceptions.
And it doesn't stop there. We also see patterns when it comes to political terms and how they influence country names.
All right, I'm all ears. What other surprising patterns have you uncovered in my sources?
Let's revisit this idea of historical hangovers for a moment. Remember how Estados Unidos is masculine because of the word estados? Oh, there's another example. That often trips up Spanish learners. The Netherlands.
Ah, yes, the Netherlands, or should I say Hollanda? I always get those two mixed up.
That's where the confusion lies. Many people assume that Hollanda is the official Spanish name. And while it's commonly used, the official term is actually Países Bajos.
Países Bajos, which, if I'm remembering our grammatical gender rules correctly, would be
masculine plural. It literally means low countries. And países is a masculine noun. So we have Los Países Bajos.
So even though Hollanda ends in A and sounds feminine, it's not actually the official name, and the official name is masculine. Because of that root word, it's like those historical forces are still shaping how we speak today.
Exactly. It's a prime example of how traditional usage can clash with official designations, reminding us that language is constantly in flux, reflecting both the past and the present.
Okay, so sometimes the correct gender isn't so clear-cut. What other mysteries are lurking within these country names?
Let's take a trip to a continent that often causes confusion, even among native Spanish speakers.
Antarctica.
Antarctica.
Antarctica. We touched on it before, but something about it always felt a bit off to me.
You're right to question it. Remember how we talked about islands and continents generally being feminine in Spanish? Because of that connection to la tierra, the earth, Antarctica fits that pattern. But its ending doesn't quite follow the usual A rule.
Right. It ends in Ada. And sometimes we see Alica for other feminine nouns, so why not El Antártida?
That's where the power of tradition truly shines. Despite the ending, La Antártida has always been feminine in Spanish, and that usage has simply persisted. Sometimes language defies strict logic and embraces those historical quirks.
It's like the feminine gender is so deeply ingrained in the concept of landmass that it overrides any other grammatical considerations, almost like a subconscious link to Mother Earth or something. It's fascinating how those ancient connections can still influence us today.
Precisely. It demonstrates that language is more than just a set of rules. It's a living tapestry woven with threads of history, culture, and human perception.
Okay, I'm ready for another curveball. What other twists and turns have you discovered in your research?
Let's go back to the idea of a country changing its name and how that can impact its grammatical gender. We talked about Swaziland becoming Eswatini, but there's another example that's even more complex. Burma, now known as Myanmar.
Oh, that's a good one. In English, it seems like everyone has switched over to Myanmar, but what happens in Spanish?
That's where things get really interesting. The traditional Spanish name was Birmania, which, with that A ending, was clearly feminine.
So, La Birmania. Makes sense. But what happens when the country becomes Myanmar?
Well, Myanmar doesn't give us any obvious gender clues based on its ending. Logically, you'd think it would default to masculine, like El Myanmar.
Right, following the pattern we've seen with other name changes. But I have a feeling it's not that simple, is it?
You know me too well. Here's the twist. Some Spanish speakers, particularly in Spain, still use the older feminine Birmania. Others, especially in Latin America, have adopted Myanmar and treat it as masculine.
Wow, so we have this linguistic divide. One country, two genders, depending on where you are in the Spanish-speaking world.
Exactly. It's language in transition. When a country changes its name, it often takes time for the corresponding grammatical gender to settle into a consistent usage.
That makes me wonder which form will ultimately win out. Will Birmania make a comeback? Or will Myanmar solidify its masculine status? It's like a linguistic tug of war.
It truly is a fascinating linguistic battle to observe. And it highlights that even something as seemingly fixed as grammatical gender can be subject to change and variation based on cultural factors, geographic location, and even individual preferences.
It's a good reminder that language is never truly static. It's constantly evolving and adapting to reflect the ever-changing world around us. Okay, so we've tackled historical quirks, confusing name changes, even a bit of linguistic tug of war. What else do you have for us?
Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about another category of geographical features that often have unexpected genders in Spanish. Rivers.
Rivers. Honestly, I never even thought about those having a gender.
Is another one of those things that native Spanish speakers might not even think twice about. But it can definitely be a head-scratcher for language learners.
So are they all masculine, feminine, or a mix of both?
There's definitely a pattern here, and it ties back to some of those cultural perceptions we discussed earlier. You'll notice that many major rivers around the world are considered masculine in Spanish.
Really? Give me some examples.
Think of some of the most iconic rivers. El Amazonas, the Amazon, El Nilo, the Nile, El Mississippi, the Mississippi, all masculine.
You're absolutely right. I never even noticed that before. But why would rivers lean towards the masculine gender?
It likely goes back to those historical associations of rivers, with strength, power, and traditionally masculine roles. Rivers have long been seen as forces of nature, providers of life, but also capable of great destruction.
That makes sense. If we think about those cultural perceptions again, it's easy to see how those ideas of strength and power might be projected onto rivers and reflected in their grammatical gender.
Exactly. It's another reminder that language is never truly neutral. It's constantly shaped by the history culture and even the unconscious biases of its speakers.
Okay, so we've got masculine rivers representing those ancient ideas of power, but are there any feminine rivers out there? Or is it just a boys' club?
There are some feminine rivers, but they tend to be less common. And often their gender can be traced back to specific linguistic or historical reasons.
I love those aha moments when there's a deeper explanation. What's an example of that?
One example is La Plata, the River Plate in South America. It's feminine, but not because of any inherent feminine qualities of the river itself. It's because the name Plata is a feminine noun in Spanish, referring to silver.
Ah, so it's named after silver. And that makes the river feminine by association. It's all about those hidden connections.
Exactly. Another example is La Sena, the Seine River in Paris. Again, it's feminine because Sena is a feminine noun in Spanish, although its origin and meaning are a bit more obscure.
So sometimes it's about those hidden meanings and etymological roots. It's like we're linguistic detectives, uncovering the clues behind these seemingly random gender assignments. But wait. If most major rivers are masculine because of those ideas of power and strength, does that mean feminine rivers are seen as somehow weaker or less important?
That's a great question. It brings up an important point. While those cultural associations are definitely at play, it's crucial to remember that grammatical gender doesn't necessarily equate to real-world gender roles or power dynamics.
So even though those historical connections exist, a feminine river isn't inherently weaker than a masculine river.
Precisely. It's more about the linguistic conventions of the language and how they have evolved over time. We can appreciate those historical influences without imposing modern interpretations of gender onto these grammatical categories.
That's a helpful reminder. It's so easy to get caught up in those cultural interpretations, but ultimately we're talking about grammatical categories, not social hierarchies.
Absolutely. Language is complex and full of fascinating layers of meaning and historical baggage. But it's our job to unpack those layers and understand them in their full context.
I'm loving this linguistic deep dive. We've gone from simple word endings to historical legacies, political undertones, and now we're even exploring how ancient perceptions of power are reflected in the names of rivers.
And the journey's not over yet. There are still more linguistic treasures waiting to be unearthed. In the final part of our exploration.
All right, lead the way. I can't wait to see what other fascinating insights you've uncovered. Welcome back for the final stretch of our grammatical gender adventure. I have to say, I'm looking at maps in a whole new way now. Who knew there were so many layers of meaning hidden within the names of countries?
It's a testament to how language can act like a time capsule, preserving echoes of ancient beliefs and cultural shifts. And today we're going to unearth one last linguistic treasure that demonstrates just how adaptable and complex the Spanish language truly is.
All right, lay it on me. What's this final revelation you've pulled from my sources?
Let's talk about a concept that might seem a bit counterintuitive at first. The idea that sometimes breaking the rules can actually reinforce the overall system.
Okay, now that's interesting. How can breaking the rules make things more rule-bound?
Think about it this way. Grammatical rules are there to provide a framework for understanding and using language. But language is also a living, breathing thing, constantly evolving to meet the needs of its speakers.
So those rules aren't set in stone. There's room for flexibility and evolution.
Absolutely. And sometimes those seemingly broken rules actually highlight the underlying patterns and logic of the system in a really fascinating way.
I'm following you so far. But how does this apply to the grammatical gender of countries in Spanish? Give me a concrete example.
Let's go back to that idea of large land masses, typically being feminine in Spanish. We talked about La Gran Bretaña, the Antártida, but there's a notable exception that might seem to break this rule. Canada.
Canada, you're right. That's interesting. It's a massive landmass, but it's masculine. What's the story there?
It all boils down to the origin of the name. Canada doesn't come from a Spanish word. It's derived from an indigenous Iroquoian term. When this term was adopted into Spanish, it was treated as a masculine noun, likely because of its ending.
So even though it seems to break the landmass equals feminine pattern, it still follows the basic rule of masculine endings, typically signaling a masculine noun.
Exactly. By breaking one specific pattern, it actually reinforces the broader principle that word endings are a key factor in determining grammatical gender.
It's like a linguistic paradox. By breaking one rule, it highlights the importance of the other rules in the system. It's amazing how much thought and history goes into something as seemingly simple as whether a country is el or la.
Every exception we've encountered tells a story, whether it's Los Estados Unidos, Los Países Bajos, or even those rivers that buck the trend. These rule breakers reveal deeper layers of linguistic logic and cultural influence.
This entire deep dive has been so eye-opening. We've gone from simple word endings to historical legacies, political undertones, and even moments of grammatical rebellion that actually strengthen the system as a whole.
It really highlights how language is a reflection of the human experience, full of nuance, contradiction, and constant evolution.
So what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners today? What do we want them to walk away with after this exploration?
I think the key message is this. Grammatical gender in Spanish isn't just about memorizing rules. It's about understanding the historical, cultural, and even political forces that have shaped those rules over time.
It's about appreciating those nuances, embracing the exceptions, and recognizing that even those rule breakers can reveal deeper insights into how language truly works.
Exactly. It's about seeing language not as a static set of rules, but as a living, breathing entity that reflects the complexity and beauty of the human experience.
Beautifully said. I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about. Now it's their turn to go out and explore the grammatical gender mysteries of their own languages. Who knows what fascinating stories and cultural insights they might uncover?
The world of language is full of hidden treasures waiting to be discovered. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop being curious about the power of words.
Until next time, word nerds, happy deep diving.